This video lecture is about what is cultural anthropology. By this point, you've been introduced to the field of anthropology as a whole, and now we're going to start really digging into the details of what each subfield within the broader discipline of anthropology has to offer. That is, what are the particular topics and techniques, methods, theories that each subfield uses to forward its understanding of what it means to be human. So cultural anthropology is a qualitative social science. It's one in which cultural anthropologists spend time living in contexts where they learn from communities about their day-to-day lives. Anthropologists, cultural anthropologists are especially interested in the most mundane elements of what it means to be a human being living amongst other human beings. All those little things we do day in and day out that add up to something that we often refer to as a worldview or as culture. And that's one of the main concepts I want to focus on in this lecture, is the concept of culture, which is really central to the subfield of cultural anthropology. As we move forward, you'll see that culture is something that we are all steeped in. We live in worlds which are following a particular sort of cultural framework, even as we are often not particularly aware of it. Sort of like a fish in water, you often don't think twice about all the things you do within the cultural world of which you are a part. It just comes naturally. It just feels like the way things are. One of the benefits of learning about cultural anthropology and starting to some extent to take on the perspective of cultural anthropology is it allows you to think a little bit differently, both about cultural worlds that are unfamiliar to you and about your own life as a cultural being. One of the phrases that's often used to describe that is that what cultural anthropology does is it makes the strange familiar and the familiar strange. Makes the strange familiar in the sense that cultural practices and perspectives that may right now seem really different and really foreign to you will come to be practices that you can gain an understanding and an appreciation for. And the flip side of that is that things you do right now without thinking about it, once you take on that sort of cultural anthropological lens, you'll be able to think a little bit more critically about what you do, not as just the way things are, but as a culturally informed practice. So that is sort of one of our goals in our study of cultural anthropology within this course, is to work on making the strange familiar and the familiar strange. So in this lecture, I'm following up on the readings that you've begun doing. And I know we've already talked a bit earlier in the course about anthropology as a whole, but the first chapter that you read sort of talks about the different parts of anthropology. So I want to just very quickly run over those to help you locate yourself for this lecture in the specific subfield of cultural anthropology. So anthropology as a whole can be summed up, if I had to do it in one sentence, as the study of what it means to be human across space and over time. That's obviously a vast subject. So to try to take that vast subject on, anthropology approaches it from multiple perspectives. There are, in fact, 4 subfields within anthropology. In this course, we're focusing on the largest 3 of those subfields. We're not going to be talking in detail about linguistic anthropology. But there are 4 subfields within anthropology, again, meant to complement one another and to provide a holistic, well-rounded view of this complex phenomenon, which is what it means to be human. Biological anthropology, which you've already started learning about and will learn a lot more about this semester, focuses on the biological aspects of what it means to be human. Subjects such as human evolution or human biological variation, and includes the study of our closest primate relatives. Archaeology is similar in some ways to cultural anthropology. It's also interested in human societies, but it focuses on those societies in the past. And the way that archaeologists access information about those societies of the past is through looking at the materials that they left behind. Linguistic anthropology, which we won't focus on in this course, is a smaller subfield which focuses on language and cultural context. It's a sort of sister discipline to linguistics. And last but not least, cultural anthropology, which is the focus of this lecture, is about contemporary human social life. So cultural anthropologists are interested in people who are still alive, living in the world today, and trying to understand all of those things that make their lives what they are, what it means to navigate through that particular cultural world, and what the worldview or the framework of people living in that space looks like. So again, cultural anthropology is the study of contemporary human social life. As the name suggests, the concept of culture is central to the field of cultural anthropology. And culture is not always an easy concept to take on board. It's complex. Cultural anthropologists themselves often debate what exactly it is, what it means, and our understandings of culture have shifted over time. But it's central, it's a foundational concept, and that's the concept I want to turn to next. Okay. So, as the name suggests, right, it's called cultural anthropology. Culture is one of our key concepts. So I want to talk a little bit, and I know the reading that you did, the chapter in Perspectives, talks quite a bit about culture. So I want to sort of add to that what you already have learned, and I want to break down some of the characteristics of this culture concept because it is so defining of the field of cultural anthropology, and because we're going to sort of be working with this concept throughout the whole semester. That said, it's not like there's an easy definition. In fact, cultural anthropologists have been debating for more than 100 years about what culture is and what the concept of culture even means. And there have been various moments in the history of the field when people have said we should toss that concept out, it doesn't work, it doesn't make sense. So even cultural anthropologists themselves do a lot of discussing about it. So it's not the easiest concept to get a hold of, but we're going to try. So for the purposes of this moment, I want to define culture as everything that people do, feel, think, and say in the context of a particular social world. So there's two things I want you to notice about that definition. The first is that it's holistic in terms of thinking about experience, right? So it's not just the things you sort of enact, the things you do. It's also stuff that you feel internally or that you think. It's also about how you communicate to other people. So all those aspects, and grounded in a particular social context. So in other words, culture as manifest in different places in the world is going to look different, right? It's not the same everywhere. There's a commonality to the fact that all humans are cultural, but the particular form that cultural worlds take from place to place is quite variable. Okay, so that is our sort of working definition for now. I want to give you a couple of other quotes now, just to sort of keep you thinking about what culture is. The first is by an anthropologist named Reich, who said this: "To be human is to be simultaneously the recipient of millions of years of culture and to be active as a creator of culture." We're going to expand on this a little bit more, but I wanted to include this quote because I think it nicely sums up one of the key qualities of culture that I want you to understand, which is that it is patterned, right? The way that each of you thinks about and lives your life in the world is informed by the culture in which you grew up. It's informed by what you learned from your parents or guardians or community members and teachers and friends and the media around you and all those different sources of information. But that doesn't mean you're some kind of cultural robot walking around following some kind of script that was handed down to you. The fact is you're also an individual with free will, and you're somebody who can take what you've learned from your elders and from your community, and you can do something different with it. And you can, in fact, resist it or change it, right? So you are both the bearer of culture, something that started before you. You're bringing something from the past into the future. And you are also an innovator, right? A creator of culture. So this dynamic between continuity and constant innovation, constant change, flux, is one of the key qualities of culture that I want us to think about. Along the same lines, and I didn't get the name on here, but this second quote is by an anthropologist named Spradley. And he says, cultural knowledge is not a list of rules, but, quote, a set of principles for map making and navigation. So again, along the lines of this idea that culture is something that's passed down to you, that you don't make it up, you don't start from scratch with culture, you're inheriting something in a certain way. But again, it's not a limitation. It's something that you then use in creative ways moving forward. So let me break down a few then of the characteristics of culture. First one, culture is learned. We as human beings are different than most, not all. There's some debate about whether other primates also have something that we might recognize as culture, but we're different than most other animals in the sense that we are not born with sort of instinct that would guide us on how to survive in the world. What you know about how you are to behave and what the world around you means is something that someone taught you, that you learned, again, typically from the people you grow up around, your family, in whatever form your family took. A lot of that learning is not explicit. Someone doesn't necessarily sit you down and say, here's how to be a culturally appropriate resident of the United States in the year 2020, but you absorb all that information from your cultural environment in a very similar way to the way that babies and children absorb language, for example, right? We don't have to put babies through language school. They learn how to speak by being around people speaking, right? In the same way, you learn how to be enculturated by being immersed in a cultural world and experiencing that over time. So again, it's not something that you sort of naturally know how to do. It's something that you learn from other humans around you. Culture is also shared. By definition, when we talk about culture, we're talking about something that is about social life. So it is passed certainly across generations, as I just suggested in that last slide, and it's shared sort of laterally, sort of across families and across communities and across societies. So by definition, culture is a shared worldview. On the other hand, even though it's shared, and it's, again, something passed down over generations, it's also something that's in flux. So culture is constantly changing over time. For example, the slide alludes to changing conceptions of what marriage is. Certainly in the US, we've seen considerable change in the sort of what is understood to be the basis for marriage, even just over the last several decades. So again, culture is not a straitjacket, it's not a script. It's a set of principles. It's also a set of principles that can be adjusted and changed over time, and they always are. Culture also includes universals. So as variable as culture is, there's certain stuff that we see pretty much everywhere. This is an image of a family composed of a man who has several wives and their children. And I put this slide up because marriage as an institution is one of those things that is human universal, or quasi. What we find is that human societies everywhere do some of the same kinds of things, right? There's some version of marriage in again, almost everywhere in the world. But what we find is the particular ways that marriage is enacted vary considerably from place to place. Culture is also integrated. What I mean by that is that even as we tend to think of different aspects of culture as separate categories, and for example, even a course like this one, we're going to talk about these different components of human social life, sort of one after the other, as if they are, separate pieces of a puzzle. So economics versus politics versus marriage and family versus ethnic identity, etc. But the fact of the matter is that in actual life, in practice, culture is integrated, which means that all those aspects of human social life are actually all tangled together. They're all part of a whole. So this image, for example, which you may have seen some of these posters in the last couple of years, these are created by an artist named Shepard Fairey, and they are, I would say, both a good example of politics and a good example of art, right? They're expressive culture, but they're also very much a part of contemporary political culture. Culture is also symbolic. And what I mean by that is that human culture, employs various elements that stand in for something else and that serve to allow us to communicate about things. The most obvious element of symbolic culture is language. So a sound is, a language is symbolic in the sense that a sound stands in for a concept or an idea. So, for example, the sound dog, which symbolizes my canine companion, of which I have a couple in the room who have been making noise while I'm making this video, is an arbitrary association of that particular sound with a concept in the world. It allows us to communicate about that element. But it's a bit arbitrary, right? So the sound that people in different places in the world associate with my canine companion is a different sound. Excuse me. Likewise, human culture employs various other symbols. The slide, for example, alludes to the U.S. flag as a symbolic element. It certainly stands for or alludes to the nation of the United States, and we find that things like flags are used the world over to call up not only ideas about political entities like the nation state, but ideas of patriotism and civic engagement. Culture also creates categories. What I've included here is the one component of the U.S. Census form. It's the question that asks about race, racial identity. There are those dogs again. Sorry. Working from home. And we're going to talk about the census a bit more later in the course, but one of the things you'll find if you look at census forms over time is that they always ask about racial and ethnic identity. So they're sort of consistent. But one of the things you'll also find is that the exact categories that are included in those questions change over time. And I think we've all had the experience of needing to check a box on a form like this one. So this is an example of the ways that cultural frameworks create categories. So racial and ethnic identity is a sort of human construct for thinking about who people are. And things like the census form are mechanisms for creating those categories amongst people. Culture is also used creatively. I've talked about this a bit already in this lecture. This slide is an image of the discipline of capoeira, which is a form of expressive culture that we find primarily in the country of Brazil, which is sort of in between martial arts and dance. And it also alludes to the history of the country of Brazil. and particularly the passage of people of African descent who were transported as slaves to that South American country. So there's something that is sort of about martial arts and combat that's embedded in this form, but there's also something that looks very much like expressive culture and dance. So again, this is just to suggest, and it also embodies history, right? So there's something about this form that I think very much encapsulates that notion of human culture as being a sort of creative endeavor. Culture is also partly unconscious. What I mean by that is that because we are all immersed in our own cultural world, there's certain elements of what we do that we come to take for granted, that we don't even recognize as such. Something like greeting practices, what you do when you first meet someone, how close to them you stand, whether you make bodily contact, whether you don't. I know we're in the middle of a pandemic where social distancing is the norm, so this may seem like an especially sort of foreign concept right at this moment, but in general, what we find is that some of those aspects of culture that you are sort of, again, taught from a young age and that are reinforced over time, you cease to think of them as something other than just the norm, just the way things are done. This slide, again, alludes to that particular issue of greeting people, etc., that is universal in the sense that we do it everywhere, but that is specific to place and time. If you've ever traveled somewhere where people either stand closer or farther apart when they talk to one another, you'll notice that feeling of something being different. That speaks to the fact that there's a partially unconscious cultural element there. So I want to end with a couple of other important concepts for cultural anthropology. So we talked about culture quite a bit now. Another key concept is cultural relativism. Cultural relativism, in the context of the field of cultural anthropology, means trying to understand cultural practices, worldviews different than your own, in their own framework, from their own perspective. Okay? So it means, for example, if you encounter a cultural practice different than what you are used to, you will start by suspending your own cultural worldview, your own judgments or assumptions, and will instead try to understand that cultural practice from the perspective of the people who consider that the norm. Okay? So that is both a sort of concept for scholarly analysis, for the study of cultural anthropology, and it's also, frankly, a way of thinking about engaging with other people in the world. This is one of the reasons that I think cultural anthropology is really relevant to all of us. Now, I want to make a couple of distinctions then, understanding that definition of cultural relativism. The first is that cultural relativism is opposed to the notion of ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is assuming that your own cultural framework, your own way of doing things is the center of the world, that it's the best way, the norm, the most obvious, and that therefore other ways of doing things are less than, less appropriate, problematic, etc. So cultural relativism, which is the ethos of cultural anthropology, it's one of the defining principles of cultural anthropology, is opposed to ethnocentrism. It attempts to challenge ethnocentrism. So by embracing the approach of cultural anthropology, we will attempt to get beyond, or to challenge, or to not fall into ethnocentric practices. All right. Now, all of that said, cultural relativism, on the other hand, is not the same as moral relativism. Sometimes when people talk about cultural relativism, they suggest that it means you can't have an opinion about what's right and wrong, right? That by embracing cultural relativism, you have to assume that whatever people do in their own cultural world, it's okay. the vast majority of cultural anthropologists would take issue with that. So cultural relativism is absolutely about suspending your own cultural framework in order to best understand the perspective of people in a particular social context. But it does not mean letting go of or abandoning your moral compass, for example. Lots of anthropologists are very, very concerned, for example, about upholding people's human rights and would embrace a concept of universal human rights. That is, that people have the right to expect health, education, to be treated well, etc., to expect justice in the world. Being a cultural relativist and understanding that culture is variable, and that, for example, as the top slide shows, that there is no food that is more delicious or more disgusting than any other, that it's all about your cultural perspective on what tastes good. One can embrace that and still expect that there is some universal and be committed to human well-being and to be concerned about human suffering, right? So cultural relativism is opposed to ethnocentrism, but I would suggest that cultural relativism is not the same as moral relativism. Okay. We've talked a lot already. I've given you a lot of key concepts for the study of cultural anthropology. And again, I just want to reiterate, as I did in our welcome video, that I'm available if you have questions about the course or about anything else about your time at Northeastern. Please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. Keep reading, keep looking at the syllabus. Let me know if you have any questions, and we'll talk again soon. Bye-bye.